Time now for Hard Talk.
Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen Sackur. What exactly is progressive politics? In the rich world, it's identified with the centre-left, with a faith in the state's ability to ameliorate the perceived excesses of market capitalism. Well, my guest today has a much more ambitious take on what it means to be progressive. Roberto Unger is an influential Brazilian political philosopher who taught Barack Obama law at Harvard, and he served as former President Lula's so-called Minister of Ideas in Brazil. He calls himself a revolutionary, but is the world, rich or poor, ready for his progressive revolution? Roberto Unger, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you.
You are a long-established political thinker of the left, but you seem very disillusioned with the politics of the mainstream left in the United States and indeed other parts of the world too. Why?
On the whole, today, throughout the world, the progressives have no project. Their project is the project of their conservative adversaries with a humanizing discount. They seek to put a softer face on the agenda of their conservative opponents, and that's not what we need.
That's not important? Isn't humanizing politics important?
It's not good enough. What the world is seeking now, restless as it is, under the dictatorship of no alternatives, is an alternative that would give opportunity and instruments to the ordinary man and woman. Sugarcoating is not enough.
In my introduction to you, I used the word revolutionary. Do you really see yourself as a revolutionary?
Well, we used to think that any consequential change would have to come all of a sudden in the form of a substitution of one system for another, socialism for capitalism. I don't believe that. I believe that change can be substantial, but nevertheless piecemeal, gradualist, and experimental. A great problem that we have now in the world is that we understand that real change must be structural. It must have to do with the organization of the market economy and of democratic politics. But unlike the liberals and the socialists of the 19th century, we can no longer commit ourselves to a dogmatic blueprint. So how then can we think and act with regard to the structure without subscribing to one of these dogmas?
So let me just pick away at history a little bit. If you're saying revolution doesn't have to be violent, it doesn't have to be an explosive one-off event, it can be gradual and it must be structural, then where would you place somebody like FDR and the New Deal and that period of democratic politics in America, which to many was revolutionary? Did you see that as revolutionary?
The New Deal at the beginning was the last major episode of institutional experimentation in the United States. And we need a lot more of that now. For 200 years, ideological debate in the world has been dominated by a simple model: the state against the market. More state, less market, or more market, less state, or some synthesis of the two. Now, a new contest is beginning to emerge about the alternative forms of the market economy, of democratic politics, and of independent civil society.
All right, well, let me pin you down then to some definitions. New forms of market, does that mean you are opposed to free market capitalism as we understand it today, or not?
It's not enough to regulate the market. It's not enough to compensate for the inequalities of the market through retrospective tax and transfer programs. What we need is to reshape the market in its institutional context.
Yeah, but what does that mean?
So that more people have more access to more markets in more ways. So what does it mean? Well, I'll give you some examples of what it means in different areas. First, we now have emerging in the world a new style of production, which is characterized by permanent innovation. We often associate it with high technology. But this innovative, vanguardist style of production is typically confined to narrow vanguards of each national economy, weakly connected with the rest. And the great majority of the labor force is excluded from these vanguards. What we need is to disseminate these advanced practices through large sectors of the economy and the society. Second, finance and the real economy. So,
and let me stop you there, if I may, because important things are being said, and I want to get to the heart of each one as you say it. You've cited the example of Silicon Valley, the creativity, the sort of immense vitality of that particular corner of the US economy, and you've sort of implied that you want to see the whole of the American economy, indeed maybe even to take your home country Brazil as well, the whole of the Brazilian economy imbued with that element of creativity and added human value. But I'd put it to you that that is just fantasy. I mean,
no.
a national economy, a huge national economy, can never be Silicon Valley writ large. It just wouldn't work that way.
Not in the form of high technology, but that's not the point. The most important agents in contemporary economies are a multitude of small and medium-sized businesses. And most of these businesses throughout the world, in the United States, in Brazil, are pushed back to a rear guard of relatively primitive production. What we need is to give very large parts of the labor force access to these advanced productive practices. Now,
but the state's not going to be the vehicle for doing that, is it? Surely the whole message of Silicon Valley and the rise of people like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs is that they did what they did with an element of genius, not because of state interventions or state messages, but because of something within themselves.
So we have two models of relations between government and business in the world. We have the American model of arm's length regulation of business by government, and we have the Northeast Asian model of imposition of a unitary trade and industrial policy by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. What we do not have and need is the example of a decentralized partnership between governments and firms to the end of disseminating these advanced practices through large parts of each national economy.
Interesting comparison, but I can't help reflecting that if you look at success and failure in the global economy right now, much of the success lies in those very Asian economies, think South Korea or maybe even China itself, who are delivering incredible rates of growth and industrial development and highly educated workforces, particularly in the case of South Korea.
Temporarily, because they have not solved the fundamental problem of generalizing innovation and educational capability throughout their societies. So this change in the structure of the market economy has to run in parallel with several other changes. First, it has to be complemented by a radical change in the character of education. We need a form of education that is analytic, that deals with information only selectively as a device of the acquisition of analytic capabilities, that is cooperative rather than individualist and authoritarian, and that is dialectical in its approach to receive knowledge. That is to say, introduces students to ideas always through contrasting points of view.
All right, well, you have laid out there a vision for what you think a society can deliver, making the most of the potential of its people. But let's move away from the abstract to the deeply political. I began by asking you about the Democratic Party and the left. Let's bring it right up to date and talk about Barack Obama. You welcomed his election in 2008, and that was significant because you used to teach Barack Obama at Harvard Law School. You have since written very powerful condemnations of Barack Obama, describing him as a disaster for the Democratic Party and for progressives. Why disaster?
Because the Democratic Party, under his leadership, has failed to come up with a sequel to Roosevelt's New Deal. There is no project in the United States responsive to the needs and aspirations of the broad working class majority of the country. Obama and his collaborators have mistaken conformism for realism. They think they've grown up. In fact, they've fallen down.
Isn't this the difference between you as a political theorist and philosopher and Barack Obama, who lives in the real world of Washington politics? He has done what he can to drive a quote-unquote liberal agenda. He passed, through the investment of massive political capital, his Affordable Health Care Act. He put a huge amount of stimulus into the economy, Keynesianism, to keep America working.
Vulgar Keynesianism,
and
yes.
He bailed out the auto industry to maintain American jobs. Those are all things that he did because of his vision of what government can do to help ordinary people. That's progressive politics, isn't it?
Very limited. No challenge to the dominant economic structure of the country. No attempt to reorganize the relation of finance.
America doesn't want America is not a revolutionary country. It's a country with small c conservatism writ large in its DNA.
It's an experimentalist country. It's a country, the central creed of which is faith in the constructive genius of ordinary men and women. This faith has lived under the burden of an institutional idolatry. The sin of the public culture of the United States is the tendency to believe that the country discovered at the time of its foundation the definitive formula of a free society. Tendency to believe that the country discovered at the time of its foundation the definitive formula of a free society, and that the rest of humanity must either subscribe to this formula or continue to languish in poverty and despotism. Now the United States needs institutional innovation to give opportunity and equipment to the ordinary man and woman.
But the point for you is whether what you are saying is realistic in the context of today's America, with today's Congress, the balance of powers as it exists in America.
Every
today.
transformation worth thinking about, defined as a direction for the long term, can be translated into steps right now.
You talked to Obama, I mean, I know you communicated with him by email long after he left Harvard Law. You've stayed broadly in touch with him. Why do you believe he has failed to fulfill your hopes for him? I mean, is it because he's not prepared to show leadership? He's not prepared to go up against the forces that you say are working against the sorts of change you want? What is it?
The most important attributes of a statesman are tenacity, courage, hope, and vision. He and his collaborators have demonstrated only the first of the four and proved deficient in the other three, while being prodigal in words that exalt the virtues in which they are lacking.
I'm just looking at the words here of political theorist Stephen Holmes, who has looked at a lot of your ideas about what America needs in terms of a new progressive politics. And he says that you constantly toy with the idea that America needs a new age of conflict. It needs some catastrophe, some serious moment of crisis.
No, catastrophe, no, just the opposite.
Well, he calls it a preposterous romanticization of instability.
Just the opposite, just the opposite. So the limited forms of democratic politics that we now have in the world are forms that require crisis to make change possible.
So do you welcome that crisis?
I want just the opposite. I want us to organize politics and democracy so that we do not need trauma as the condition of transformation.
Let me, if I may then, turn our focus to Brazil, away from the rich world to a very important developing country and economy, and look at what happened when you were invited inside the tent, inside the system in Brazil. President Lula, who you once criticized...
I agreed to work with him in his second term.
And then you described him
to work with him
a man of vision.
In the redirection of the country.
Right.
And
do you think when you were brought inside the system and you became Minister for Strategic Affairs, some called you his Minister for Ideas, do you think you really made a difference?
There were two great achievements in Lula's government for the country. First, Brazil democratized on the demand side. Increase of the wage, social programs that diminish poverty and inequality to a lesser extent.
But weren't those precisely the sorts of entitlement programs that in America you say
yes,
are just meddling at the edges and not dealing with real radical structural
popularization of access to consumption? That was one achievement, and a real achievement in a country that is as radically unequal as ours. And the second achievement was an imaginative achievement. When the Brazilian people accepted Lula, one of them, as their leader, they accepted themselves. And that was a revolutionary change in the spiritual life of the people. What we have failed to achieve so far is a transition to the achievement of another much more difficult and important task, which is democratizing on the supply side, on access to the resources and opportunities of production and education. That democratizing of the market economy would in turn require a deepening of democracy. That's what I fought for in the government, and that's what I failed to achieve.
But, you know, again, it comes back to this divide between the philosopher and the practical politician. The Workers' Party's still in power. Lula effectively handpicked his successor, Dilma Rousseff. She says, sticking by the Lula agenda, and yet what we see in Brazil today is, frankly, a stuttering economy. We see riots and protests from the poor on the streets of Brazil's big cities. We see the corporate economy in big trouble, with Brazil's richest man going bust. You know, you were part of a government and a philosophical approach to changing Brazil, which, with all due respect, doesn't seem to have
I opposed the dominant approach. I opposed it when in opposition, and I opposed it when in government. It's easy to be a realist if you accept everything. And it's easy to be a visionary if you confront nothing. What we have to do is to accept very little and to confront a great deal.
Well, that is where some in Brazil quarrel with you. I mean, for example, the analyst Bolivar Lamounier in the New York Times, when you were in power, in the ministry and government, he said the problem with Unger is that he's too messianic for this country, for Brazil. You know, you have very big ideas about the complete radical reorganization of the structures of the country, but it ain't practical.
Brazil is very open to an alternative message. That was my experience throughout. But we lack the institutions. So it's a very long road. But the road has to begin in consciousness, in ideas. We can't change the world without ideas. And the experience of Obama and his people that we addressed a moment ago confirms once again the truth that the world cannot be changed by the worldly.
One word we haven't, between us, uttered is the word socialism. Just north of Brazil, there is Venezuela. Now, not so very long ago, I went to Caracas to talk to the late Hugo Chavez. Hugo Chavez is gone, but President Maduro is there and says he's sticking by the Bolivarian socialist revolution. You have a lot of contacts in Latin America and beyond. Is there any future in socialism, in your view, as a way of restructuring and reordering the economy to achieve what you want, the full sort of potential of every individual human being?
No one knows today what socialism means. So why be hung up on these abstractions?
Well, when you go to Venezuela and talk to your friends in Venezuela and they tell you our revolution, our socialism
I tell them
will
what I believe,
deliver,
that they have no feasible strategy of economic growth and no lasting institutional model. What we need is to open the gateways of access to the advanced sectors, to enlist finance in the service of the real economy, because it can be a good servant, but is a bad master.
What do you mean enlist finance? So you want to work with the big banks, with the most massive corporate entities
I don't
in the
want
world,
finance to serve itself. I want it to serve production.
Sure, you may want it, but why would they? They wouldn't want to invest in your society.
By changes in the tax and regulatory structure that discourage financial activity unrelated to real production.
But the danger is you end up having to nationalize, or at least
No,
to
not at all.
regulate so heavily that no longer is this a free market capitalist system.
No, it's not statism against the market. It's the real market. It's the radicalization of the market. It's the reinvention of the market. Now, then comes a third element, which is we can't have an inclusive market economy based on universal precariousness, economic insecurity for the working person. There's a new form of production emerging in the world on the basis of decentralized networks of contractual relations, a new putting out system. We need a new regime to protect, represent, and organize that worker. We need to associate the state with civil society in the competitive and experimental provision of public services.
In so many of your prescriptions, you use the phrase, "we need." I understand, with all your learning and your many years of political philosophizing, that you have very strong views about what we need. The question is, who is the we we're talking about?
The we is humanity.
Yeah, but
the we is
hang on a
humanity
second.
that's
Let me just
united.
finish my point.
Yes.
You have to decide how your ideas, some of them, frankly, pretty complex, can be turned into something that appeals to ordinary men and women in the United States, in Brazil, here in Europe too. How do you do that?
Before we persuade others, we have to persuade ourselves. We have to have a sense of the direction. Because as a philosopher once said, no wind helps the man who doesn't know to what port he's sailing. And then we have to identify in the particular circumstance the first steps by which to move in that direction.
But I just wonder whether you believe you can move in that direction with democracy as it's currently practiced, whether it be in the US or here in the UK or wherever. Because frankly, democracy is not throwing out the sorts of ideas that you're trading in.
It's not, because we have these...
So who's that the fault of? Is it the fault of the people who are just too thick to get it?
It's everyone's fault. The problem isn't an assignment of moral responsibility. The problem is then throwing ourselves into this structure in order radically to expand the sense of collective possibility. We have this very restrictive repertory now of living options in the world. And the world is restless under the yoke of this regime of no alternative.
Well, you say the world's restless. I come back to this idea about revolution. I quizzed you about it at the very beginning. There is an interesting debate here in the UK right now, and actually, funnily enough, it was in a sense, it was generated by a comedian who also styles himself a revolutionary called Russell Brand, who the other day said in a high-profile interview, he didn't want to vote. He didn't want anybody else to vote. He said voting in the democratic system that we have today is just rendering yourself complicit in a system that will never truly represent the interests of ordinary people. Do you agree with that?
No.
Is voting in our system a waste of time?
No. I think that what we need is just the opposite, to be disillusioned with disillusionment. What we need is to act, and through our actions to create alternative political institutions.
But do you mean acting outside the framework of politics, revolutionary action? Or do you mean just going to the ballot booth and expressing an opinion?
No, acting in every domain. Acting in the institutions that exist and acting outside of those institutions. So now we have, throughout the world, a form of democratic life that continues to depend on crisis to make change possible. Well, here we are in Britain, and there's a movement of devolution, of the creation of local alternatives, and it can only be fertile in the creation of national alternatives if it's then combined with a style of high-energy politics at the center.
So
that's what I want.
You believe change can happen. The system, even as it's constituted today, can deliver change.
We can only work with the world that exists. We have to meet the world on its own terms and transform it from within.
We have to end there. Roberto Unger, thank you very much for being on Hard Talk.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.